Something has clarified, not loudly, not with the dramatic internal shift you might have expected from a realization this significant. It arrived quietly, the way the most important things tend to, between one ordinary moment and the next, somewhere in the middle of a day that had nothing special about it. And what it said was not, "I want them to suffer." What it said was something far more composed, far more self-possessed, far more final. "I just want them gone from the center of my life." That sentence, or whatever version of it arrived in you, is not defeat. It is not giving up or giving in or the resignation of someone who ran out of fight. It is the specific, hard-won clarity of a person who has moved through enough of this to know the difference between what would feel satisfying in the short term and what would actually serve the life still being lived. Between the heat of wanting them to understand what they cost you and the cooler, more durable recognition that understanding from them is not what heals you. Distance heals you. The specific, deliberate, non-negotiable creation of space between who you are and what that dynamic was doing to who you are. This is what that actually means. First, the revenge impulse deserves an honest examination rather than a moral dismissal, because it was there. For most people who have been through the specific exhaustion of an avoidant dynamic, it was there. Maybe briefly, maybe with more intensity and duration than feels comfortable to admit, but present. The desire for them to feel it, to understand from the inside the experience of reaching for someone who keeps themselves just out of reach. To lie awake, passing a silence the way you passed 100 silences. To wonder where they stand, what it means, whether the distance is permanent or temporary, whether something they did caused it, or whether it is simply the machinery of the other person running its program. The desire for that recognition, for the specific experiential understanding that only feeling it could produce, is not petty. It is the deeply human need for the suffering to have been witnessed, for the cost to be acknowledged, for the imbalance to be, in some form, corrected. Justice is not a small impulse. It is one of the oldest and most legitimate needs in the human emotional repertoire, and it is also, in this specific context, a trap. Here is why revenge, even the most justified, most poetically satisfying version of it, does not give you what you actually need. Revenge requires continued orientation toward the person. It requires them to remain central, relevant, the subject around whom your energy organizes itself, your planning, your emotional investment, your sense of what constitutes a win. In order to make them feel something, you must remain sufficiently present in their life to have impact. In order to have impact, you must remain sufficiently focused on them to execute the impact. In order to remain focused on them, you must keep them installed at the center of your attention, which means revenge, however satisfying in theory, is just another form of the pattern, another configuration of the same fundamental dynamic, your energy flowing primarily in their direction, your sense of satisfaction or dissatisfaction determined by their response, your emotional state contingent on what is happening with them. The avoidant was already, for however long the dynamic lasted, the organizing principle of too much of your interior life. Every response calibrated against their temperature, every feeling filtered through the question of what it meant for them and for the relationship. Every version of yourself shaped, at least partly, by the constant negotiation of their capacity. Revenge keeps that going. Distance ends it. Distance is not the same thing as indifference. This distinction is crucial, and it almost never gets made cleanly. Indifference means not caring, the flat, affectless neutrality of someone for whom the other person simply does not register as significant. As discussed honestly in the previous conversation, that state is rarely achievable, and arguably not the goal, because the connection was real, the feeling was genuine, and pretending otherwise is its own form of suppression. Distance means not organizing around. It means the person and everything they represent has been moved from the center of your daily experience to the periphery. Not erased, relocated. From the position of primary orientation, the fixed point around which the rest of life arranged itself, to somewhere in the background, present perhaps, still carrying emotional weight perhaps, but no longer the load-bearing element of how you move through your days. That relocation is the actual work, and it is harder than either revenge or indifference precisely because it requires you to feel the full weight of what you are moving, rather than either burning it or pretending it is not there. There is a specific quality to the exhaustion that arrives when someone finally reaches the need for distance rather than revenge. It is worth naming carefully because it is not the exhaustion of defeat. It is the exhaustion of having been for too long in a state of high alert. The nervous system that spent months or possibly years in the particular vigilance of an avoidant dynamic, scanning for temperature changes, interpreting silences, calibrating responses, managing the gap between what was felt and what it was safe to express. That nervous system is genuinely depleted. Not broken, not damaged beyond recovery, depleted in the way that any system is depleted by sustained operation at a level of intensity it was not designed to maintain indefinitely. The recognition that what is needed is distance is partly the recognition that the vigilance cannot continue, that the cost of remaining in that state, emotionally, cognitively, physiologically, is a cost the body and the mind are no longer willing to pay. Not because the love is gone, because the system has reached its genuine limit and is communicating that limit with unusual clarity. When the nervous system speaks this clearly, the wisest thing available is to listen. What does the creation of genuine distance actually require? Not the performed version, not the distance that is really just suppressed pursuit, not the silence that is really waiting, dressed up as moving on. The real version, the kind with actual traction. It requires the dismantling of the monitoring, every habit of attention that kept them in the center of your awareness, the checking, the interpreting, the running calculation of where things stand and what the latest information means, needs to be interrupted. Not forcefully. Forceful interruption just moves the preoccupation underground. It needs to be gradually replaced with other objects of attention, with the life that exists outside the dynamic, which has been patiently waiting for the majority of your awareness to return to it. This is not a decision made once. It is a decision remade, sometimes many times in a single day, until the remaking becomes less effortful and eventually becomes the default. The attention that keeps drifting back is not a failure. It is the residue of a pattern that was well established. The distance is built in the gap between the drift and the return, in the practice of noticing where the attention went and gently, consistently, redirecting it towards something that is actually present, actually yours, actually happening in the life you are currently living. There is something distance does that revenge cannot approximate. It returns you to yourself. Not immediately and not linearly. The return is more spiral than straight, circling back through the same emotional territory multiple times at different depths before arriving somewhere genuinely new. But the direction is consistently inward, toward the self that existed before the dynamic compressed it, toward the desires and the capacities and the particular qualities of your interior that went quiet while the primary occupation was managing someone else's avoidance. Those parts do not die in a difficult dynamic. They go into a kind of suspension, waiting with the patient persistence of things that are genuinely part of you, for the conditions to shift sufficiently that their re-emergence becomes possible. Distance creates those conditions. The removal of the avoidant dynamic from the center of your experience creates a space that your own life rushes to fill, sometimes tentatively, sometimes with a speed that surprises you, sometimes with the particular vividness that follows a long period of sensory deprivation. The colors of your own existence become more saturated when you stop organizing your perception around someone else's emotional weather. Here is something about the avoidant specifically that is relevant to the choice of distance over revenge. The avoidant system was built to be unaffected by pursuit, by pressure, by the emotional intensity of someone who needs them to understand or to feel something or to respond in a particular way. Every form of pursuit, including the pursuit that revenge represents, confirms, at the level of the avoidance nervous system, the original dynamic. It provides evidence for the story the system was already running, that closeness is intrusive, that intensity is a reason to withdraw, that maintaining distance is the sane response to someone who is oriented toward them with high emotional stakes. Revenge, in other words, is the most avoidant confirming thing available to you. It would not produce recognition. It would produce withdrawal. Not because they are cold, not necessarily, but because the system responds to pressure by increasing distance, and pressure is all revenge can deliver. Distance, on the other hand, is the one move the avoidance system has no prepared response for. It was not designed for. It finds no familiar groove to run in when the person it expected to remain in orbit has genuinely, quietly, without drama or demand, left the orbit entirely. You already know this. It is why this realization, distance, not revenge, feels like clarity rather than compromise. The grief inside this choice deserves space, because choosing distance over revenge is also, in a way that is not always acknowledged, a form of goodbye. Revenge keeps the story alive, keeps the possibility of impact, of recognition, of the specific moment where they finally understand, keeps all of that technically available. Distance closes those possibilities, not violently, quietly. The way a door closed gently is still fully closed. And fully closed means accepting, at a level that revenge allowed you to defer, that the resolution you wanted, the acknowledgement, the understanding, the reciprocity that never quite arrived, is not coming. Not because you are unworthy of it, because the person who would have needed to deliver it had a structural limitation that no strategy and no amount of time was going to overcome without their own committed, internally driven work. That acceptance is grief, real grief. The specific grief of wanting something legitimate from someone genuinely incapable of providing it, of having done nothing wrong and still not received what was needed, of loving honestly and being met with the most honest limitation another person can offer, not malice, just incapacity. Let the grief be grief. Distance is not the avoidance of that feeling. It is the container in which that feeling can finally, fully, without the constant reactivation of hope and its subsequent disappointment, run its actual course. There is a quietness on the other side of this choice that is difficult to describe to someone who has not yet reached it. Not the quietness of nothing happening, the quietness of something finally stopping. The internal noise of an avoidant dynamic is constant and specific. The analysis, the interpretation, the ongoing, exhausting attempt to make legible something that was designed, not maliciously, but structurally, to resist legibility. The avoidance behaviour does not yield clean meaning. It does not resolve into clear information about where things stand, or what is wanted, or what is possible. It generates ambiguity at a rate that keeps the interpreting mind perpetually occupied. When distance is genuinely established, that noise stops. Not all at once. Gradually, the way the sound of traffic recedes as you move further from a highway. You only notice how loud it was once you are far enough away to hear the difference. The mind that was occupied with interpretation finds itself with space. And what fills that space, slowly, then increasingly, is the signal of your own interior, your own wants, your own sense of direction. The quiet but persistent voice that was always there and was perpetually drowned out by the louder occupation of trying to decode someone who was not, in the way you needed, available to be decoded. Distance is not weakness. This needs to be stated plainly because the cultural narrative around this kind of dynamic has a way of framing continued engagement, continued trying, continued reaching, continued investment in the possibility of change as strength, and the choice to stop as surrender. That framing is wrong, and it has kept people inside dynamics that were costing them for far longer than the cost was worth. The choice of distance requires more genuine strength than revenge. Revenge is emotionally hot. It has momentum. It carries the energy of righteous feeling and the forward motion of wanting to do something. Distance is cooler. It requires the sustained, daily, frequently unglamorous discipline of choosing yourself over the pull of the unresolved, of sitting with the discomfort of an ending that never fully announced itself as an ending, of moving forward without the closure that the situation was never going to cleanly provide. That is not weakness. That is the specific, hard to develop, rarer than it should be strength of someone who has decided that their own life, the actual present tense, ongoing, unfinished, full of possibility life, is worth more than the resolution of a dynamic that was always going to stay unresolved. One last thing. For the version of you that is still, beneath the clarity of this choice, a little bit hoping they notice the distance, that the quiet is loud enough to reach them, that the absence registers in the way absences sometimes do with avoidance, as the thing that finally makes the feeling undeniable, that hope is allowed. It does not contaminate the clarity or invalidate the choice. You are human and you loved them, and the hope that love is occasionally acknowledged is not something to be ashamed of or argued out of. But let the distance be genuine, regardless of whether that hope is fulfilled. Let it be real whether or not it produces a response. Let it be for you, entirely, primarily, non-negotiably for you, whether or not it moves them. Because the distance that is contingent on their response is not really distance. It is a new form of the same waiting, and you have waited long enough. Not for them to come back, not for them to understand, not for the ending to arrive with the clarity it refused to offer. You have waited long enough to return, fully, finally, without condition, to yourself. That return is the distance. That return is everything.